And welcome to everybody that's just jumping on now. My name is Rosie Wilmot. I'm an officer in the Sustainability and Climate Change team at Herefordshire Council. I'll be chairing today's webinar. We'll be chatting away for about 45 minutes, coming to an end just at 1:15. Throughout the topics throughout the session, if you can pop any of your questions in the chat, we are hopeful that we're going to have a bit of time at the end to pull those questions out, but we'll be circulating the recording, all of the slides, and any questions that we didn't get around to answering today. We'll make sure you all have access to those as well. So we will cover everything, even if we don't have time in the session. Most of the content is going to be delivered by people with much more experience, expertise than me. We've got Phil Quinn, the low carbon tutor at the Low Carbon Technology Training Centre at Home Lacey College, and Phil Kitchener, who's the training coordinator at the Low Carbon Technology Training Centre. They'll be taking us through looking at the need to know, the basics on solar, batteries and heat pumps. We'll be looking at some of the key ways that you can get the most out of any tech you already have, and the considerations to bear in mind for when you're if you're looking to get that tech in the future, as well as straightforward ways to assess whether that tech is right for you in your home and your business. First of all, though, we are going to be hearing from a colleague in the Sustainability and Climate Change team, Gareth Ellis. Gareth's going to be taking us through some of the ways that we can get our space ready for new technology and make sure that we're being as efficient as we can in our energy use as it stands. So, Gareth, I'll hand over to you first. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rosie. Good afternoon, everybody. Solar heat pumps, we're going to hear all the technical details on those. They are capital items. There are things you can do to make sure that you're ready for your home or your business to understand the financial benefits and the financial costs of changing how you're using your energy with solar panels or with heat pumps. The first thing is to really get an idea of what you use your electricity and gas for. So most of us have gas heating in our homes, but not everybody. Again, businesses may be different. You might have night storage heaters. You may even have radiant heaters in a situation like a workshop. Understanding what energy you're using for what is one of the most basic things that you can do to get a handle on your energy use. The second thing is understanding your tariff. So working out what you're paying for electricity and gas, understanding whether you are locked into that tariff for a certain period, and that will give you an idea, particularly with the electricity, whether that's going to be the right tariff for you going forward if you decide to invest in solar or a heat pump. It's also useful if you can understand how your energy use is distributed throughout the week, throughout the day, and throughout the year. We obviously use our heating during the winter. Things like hot water might be a lot more constant throughout the year. We tend to use refrigeration, works harder during the summer months. So if you've got a catering business, you're doing a lot of work with serving tourism, maybe the summer your energy use is in fact a little bit more higher than you might expect. You may even have less in winter if you are serving less guests and less tourists. So having an idea of what energy you use, what you use that energy for, and how you use it throughout the day and the year is going to set you up in a really good position to help understand the benefits of heat pumps and solar. But the most important thing to remember is before you invest in those, the cheapest hour of energy is the energy that you don't use. So Tina will move on the slide for me. Seamless. Thank you, Tina. Before that investment, do check whether you're using your energy efficiently as it is. Lighting, LED lighting, you'll hear a lot about it. It's simple, it's cheap, it's straightforward, and in almost every situation, it is going to be one of the most cost-benefit changes you can make, particularly if you have the old style tube lights, what's called T8s and T12, old fluorescent tubes. The LED replacements of those are a quarter of the energy use. You will save money on them in a very short period of time. Having good sensor controls, particularly in places like corridors, toilets, storerooms, sensor controls are now cheap and can reduce your energy consumption considerably and avoid you wasting it where you don't need it. Thinking about your appliances, particularly things like refrigeration or catering, are they modern? Are they high efficiency? And are you able to control them? i.e. using those appliances just when you need. Typical things are large photocopiers that sit on standby over the entire weekend. Do you have the right things in place to make sure you're controlling your appliances and only using that energy when you need? And finally, heating. You're heating your space is usually, unless you're doing industrial processes or welding or running a pottery kiln or something like that, heating is almost certainly going to be one of your largest energy costs. Is your building insulated? Have you dealt with drafts? They can dealt with simply for tens of pounds with various draft excluders and weather sealing strips. And do you control your heating system with timers? Do you make sure you're only heating your spaces when there's people in them to feel the benefit? So that's not heating your office over the weekend when there's nobody there to benefit from it. Get all those in place, get a good understanding of your energy, and you will be ready to consider solar and heat pumps. So I will pass you over to the first Phil to talk about solar.
Thanks, Gareth. That's brilliant. We're now going to hear from Phil Kitchener, and then we'll hear from Phil Quinn. So Phil K is going to take us through solar panels and battery storage, and Phil Quinn will be taking us through heat pumps. And I'll let them both introduce themselves and let you know a little bit more about the wealth of experience that they both have in those industries. Thanks, Phil. Over to you.
Thank you, Rosie, and thank you, Gareth. Yes, good afternoon all. I'm Phil Kitchener from the Low Carbon Training Centre. I've worked in this role for over a year, but within the college and delivering education for over 20 years. Prior to that, I was in industry, predominantly worked in HVAC, refrigeration control, petrochemicals in New Zealand, Australia, Africa, and the UK. Right, can I have the next slide, please? Oh, it's already gone, sorry. With regards to what we mean in solar PV, it's all about not the stuff we put on a roof to just generate hot water. This is to generate electricity. So for those of you who are unsure, it's about generating electricity from the sunlight. With regards to it, it's quite simple. There are only a few real components, although it might sound quite complicated. There are the modules on the roof, and then essentially an inverter inside the property, or could be placed external to the property or even in the loft space. Some of those depending on spatialness use. Orientation-wise, we're looking at south, not to say that you can't have other orientations, so you can't preclude just by the fact to say you don't have a south-facing roof, or you might have a flat roof. There are multiple options with regards to all of those. It's just avoiding a northerly orientation. Some people get even better results from an east-west, so they have an array on the east side and then shift to the west side in an afternoon. The strength of most structures that comply to building regs would be more than sufficient, generally speaking, for the installation of solar PV. Although shading itself can be an issue, where shading on properties can reduce outputs, and that can be taken into consideration during an audit. There are ways to mitigate and counteract that issues, and they can be down to what we call microinverters or optimizers, which could be placed on the panels to make the system more efficient. With regards to maintenance, generally a solar system is, I won't say maintenance free, but fairly low maintenance. Outputs can be increased by looking at cleaning them, but once again, because these are quite often placed at a higher position within the property, you'd need to consider whether it was appropriate for you, the end user, or to hire in an external company to do that for yourselves. Next, we'll stick with that one with regards to speaking to installers. There's a little comment there with speaking to installers. With regards to getting a quote, quotes are fairly easy to come by. Most websites will offer them, and that may not require much intervention with regards to an installer straight away. They can generate a quote quite quickly, and a more detailed quote may involve someone coming to a domestic property or commercial property to effectively check that the information inputted within the quote is accurate, and then they will be able to give you estimates on return, what they call a return on investment, or how long it would take to pay back the installation. Next slide, please. Typically a domestic system, or most systems, and it depends on how much you're going to get back of what we call time of use. So when you generate the electricity during the daylight hours, quite often in a domestic application, the property is not habited, and the fact that people are out and about and off at work, unless they're working from home. And that presents a bit of a problem, because from the sunlight and the electricity generated, then a fair proportion of that is not actually used and potentially exported onto the grid. Most systems now, you want to try and avoid that and use self-consumption, so look at about maximising self-consumption. You can come about that in different ways before we start talking about a battery, and that might actually be by the fact that you set a dishwasher coming on during the day, have a process that runs during the day, whether it be hot water, whether it be a dryer, and then maximising that generated electricity from the roof, rather than exporting onto the grid, where you may only get a small amount of income from that. On a commercial basis, it's a little bit different, because normally most businesses are their operation is taking place during the day, and that works perfectly with regards to solar, which is sitting on the roof generating electricity and then being used at time of generation. And that can work perfectly. And when you start to talk about batteries coupled with it, there may be a less requirement on a commercial application to have a battery at that point in time, rather than there would be on a domestic. With regards to generation, a typical house needs vary greatly. You might look at something like a property generating on a sunny day 20 kilowatt hours. Excuse me. Whereas in winter, that might only be 1 or 2 kilowatts hour. It can be down to as like 1/10 of the generation, and that has to be taken into consideration. Where it's great, you can have plenty of generation during the summer, probably more than you need, but in winter, it would only be supplementing. With regards to, I think we'll drop to the next slide if it's all possible, please. No slide. Slide hasn't transitioned, right. So this with regards to battery storage and how we can start to increase our self-consumption. So the addition of a battery will drastically increase your self-consumption, and the fact that if you're not being able to use it when you generate it, you might be able to store that for later use. So a typical example of that would be domestic installation, people out during the day. You might be able to store 10 kilowatt hours of electricity through the day to then use into the evening and to the following day when the sun comes up. That said, there are other options for people to install a battery system where they don't even have solar. So there is an opportunity to use off-peak tariffs to actually store energy in the battery at a lower rate, so a lower tariff, and then to be used later when the tariff's high. And just to give you an indication of price, that might be in the order of about 5p, where you draw energy in, probably at night when there's excess in the grid, store it until when you need it, and then release it back into your installation during the day. And that might be then reducing a price or a tariff that might be sitting around 35 or even higher pence per unit. So it's a considerable difference. And there are people out there that have installed batteries for that purpose alone. With regards to a commercial application, commercial applications, you need to really have a decent audit as to what you've got coming online, what are your demands, what are your uses, and then decide whether a battery is appropriate. To give you a practical example, now we have the centre here where we have a 20 kilowatt array, could at the moment in winter months only be generating 5-6 kilowatt hours a day, but in the summer that might be 100 kilowatt hours. But as a college, we are, if you like, using over 200 kilowatt hours a day, which means really using batteries of no benefit, because we always import more electricity than we're constantly generating at this point in time. What do we get to? Can I go to the next slide, please? Bit of a delay. Okay. Batteries, size, location. Typically for a domestic, I will speed up because I'm conscious of the time with regards to size and location. Size of a battery minimal is about, and it's hard for you if you can't see the picture or appreciate the size. We're talking about a suitcase as the smallest, and then can go up to quite sizable installations. With regards to location, they can be located within the property. There have been installations where they've been placed in roof space in a domestic. I would suggest that we avoid those if they're being suggested to you, because the spaces generate a lot of heat up in there in the roof space during the summer, in excess of 40 or 50 degrees, and you're putting a complicated and expensive piece of equipment up in that space. They can be placed outside. Some of them have ratings to be placed outside, and then it'll just come down to really the audit. With regards to more commercial application, we're talking a lot bigger, generally speaking, greater than 5 kilowatt hours. A 5 kilowatt hour battery, just a battery installation might be in the order of £5,000, and then you could pretty much multiply on that by a multiple of 4 if you're talking about a 20 kilowatt hour situation. Who can install? They're generally speaking a qualified electrician who has been trained with what we call EESS, which is electrical energy storage systems. So there's an additional qualification on top of the electrical qualification. We'd be looking for companies that are MCS registered, and I think there's a link at the end which will give you the ability to go on and search a register for equipment, that might be specified within a quote, and to check, and then the company themselves that they are on that register, and that gives you proof that they are effectively gone through a rigorous selection process, and their installation would be to the relevant standards. What kind of size? As I said, 5 kilowatts minimum. There are properties which will, depending on bigger properties, and the survey could be in the order of about up to 10, 15 kilowatt hours for a standard house. Generally speaking, the costs start to get quite substantial at that point. There is an ability for people to think, well, I've got a battery, I've got sun, and if the power goes off, then I'm fine. Well, that then itself is possible, but it becomes extremely complicated with regards to how you manage that energy stored within a battery and how you would then distribute it within a property or in a business situation. And that becomes quite specialised rather than just sun on the roof, generating electricity, use it or store it for later use. That is probably how most installations are being installed at this point in time. I've given you a brief overview of what the costs are involved. Just a sort of a loop back over solar, a typical domestic installation would be around about 5,000 for just a solar. Someone to come out, do a survey, put the solar panels on the roof if appropriate, put the inverter in, commission it all, and then have a working system of about what we call 4 kilowatt peak, which is about 10 panels on the roof, and it can generate 4 kilowatts on a very sunny day. If you couple to that a battery, then it tends to take the price up by another £5,000. So typically, you'd be looking for a system in a domestic situation of £5,000 for the inverter, £5,000 for the battery, so a £10,000 upward price, and that's what you'd be looking like for a domestic installation. Commercial is very bespoke down to what the needs are for the application, how big the array is going to be, and you really need to get some sort of quotes before, and it wouldn't be appropriate really for me to give you too many prices. With regards to, I'll just flick to the final slide if I can, please. Oh, not too sure what's happened there. We're getting a page which doesn't seem to have rolled correctly. It's all right, I will push on anyway. Oh, there we go. As I say, I've touched on this already. Is there a point to have a solar, if you don't have solar, to have a battery? There are people that effectively have looked at it as an income where they buy electricity in off-peak and then sell it back to the grid off-peak at a higher rate, or use it within their own property. So once again, you could have a tariff to buy it in at 7p and then use it when the price goes up to 40p within your own installation, or also to support the grid. And there are lots of these tariffs coming along with companies like Octopus, where you can actually support their infrastructure by they have access to your battery and they will tell it to start charging from the grid when there's plenty of overgeneration, and then feed it back into the grid when they require extra generation within the grid. And they will pay quite reasonable sums, which will enable people to sort of pay these systems back within 5, 6, 7 years, with life expectancy of the installations of over 10 years and warranties that sometimes extend beyond 10 years. There's lots of people looking at those as viable options. What we haven't really talked about is the fact that you could have a portable battery parked on your driveway, and the fact that you could utilise excess, sun and generated energy during the day if your car's parked at home, enabling you to, rather than have a battery, charge in your car with the excess energy. And then there's already the ability to do this in the fact that you can feed back into the grid from the car or into the property. It's in its infancy at the moment, but to enable people to effectively charge their car during the day, and then later on in the evening when there's no solar, to then feed it back into the property. So it's just a consideration. Yes, in conclusion, I think I'm tight on time really today. So really solar, definitely a benefit, I would suggest, for almost all situations. I think it's around about 5% of properties in the UK have solar. We're far behind, lagging behind a lot of Europe. And one would suggest now that most people who have solar installed will have a battery coupled to it, definitely in a domestic situation. And then it's about getting reliable information from people you trust. And as I say, if you use the MCS register, they'll give you people who work within the industry and are specialists at installing this type of technology. I'm now going to hand over to Phil Quinn, who's going to then discuss heat pumps. Thank you.
Right then, so hi guys, my name's Phil Quinn. I'm a tutor at the Low Carbon Centre. My background is as an installer, so installing these technologies both domestically and commercially. And then later on in my career, I was a designer, designing low temperature systems, and then working on project management of retrofit projects. So like whole house building fabric, getting buildings ready for low temperature heating systems. Next slide, please. There we go. So today, really, the purpose is just to give you some basic information and outline of why we like heat pumps, what they do, how they work. So as a starter, the main ones that we focus on in our market currently are air source heat pumps, ground source, and we have air-to-air systems as well. Air source is really where we will see the main push, as it's the most suitable for most applications due to space and time. So with an air source heat pump, we're using the outside air to cool or heat the home, as well as supporting hot water demand. As a pro, they're generally cheaper, easier to install than a ground source system. Some cons are they do work best in milder climates, and they do lose efficiency as the weather turns and starts to get colder. So in general, we would look at them as the best option for homes needing both heating and hot water demand with moderate insulation. So there was a point where you had to have a high level of insulation to make these systems work. That's no longer the case. Ground source systems that we see more and more of as the technology is improved. So it takes heat from the ground and it stays, the ground keeps a steady temperature all year round. So very efficient even in winter. The downside is they can be very expensive and complex to install, as well as needing a lot of space for digging trenches or boring cores. And then we also have, and really ground source will be best suited to larger properties where there is a lot of space and available room for the installation. We have air to air, which would be your more traditional air conditioning, which is a great option for commercial premises, as it provides both heating and cooling in a really cost effective way. We can use heat pumps for both cooling like air to air, but it does create some issues in how we distribute that cool air. So really, as a summary for our three systems, we would be looking at air source, good for heating, cooling and hot water. Ground source is great for efficient heating, and if you have the land and the bigger budget to accommodate it. And air to air, simpler option for heating and cooling, but without any hot water demand. We also need to look at comparing it to our more traditional systems, so gas boilers. The best way to do this really is a financial comparison, or the energy used. So with a gas boiler, for every kilowatt that we use within that boiler that will burn, we would generate really a 0.8% of heat energy back into the property. Whereas with a heat pump, we're generally looking for between 3 to 6 kilowatts back. So every kilowatt used to power that heat pump would generate 3 to 6, depending on the installation itself, depending on the demand of the property. So there's lots of things to take into consideration. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So some of the considerations that we need to take into account are the cost of buying and running these systems. So an air source heat pump installation can range anywhere from £6,000 to £15,000 as an average. This is supported by grants that are available. So we can get up to £7,500 with grants. There are companies out there already that are installing heat pumps, but almost free. So in newer properties that are well insulated, they're managing to get them in without any additional cost to the customer, just purely using the grant. From a ground source perspective, we'd be looking at in the region of £10,000 to £30,000 for the installation, again, depending on the requirements of the property. So cost to run, we'd generally be saying they're cheaper than traditional heating systems. Heat pumps are highly efficient, so often providing 3 to 6 units of heat for every unit of electricity that we use. So well worth the investment. We also need to consider the lifespan of the unit. So they can have much longer lifespans than traditional heating. So talking 15 to 20 years as a minimum. And that with reduced maintenance is one of the big benefits, as well as obviously we're massively reducing our carbon. Placement, inside space requirements. This is an important one for us to consider. So while we need to put in an outdoor unit, typically mounted near to the home or on out back, where it can't necessarily be seen, and they take up minimal ground space, but they require a hot water cylinder within the property. That's when it becomes slightly more difficult. Most people have the capacity for the unit to be placed outside, but where we do tend to find some difficulties just placing that cylinder within the building to generate our hot water capacity. Ground source, again, we require a large area for us to run our pipe work in the ground. Even though it's much more consistent, it is an important consideration. We can put in boreholes, so domestic properties are becoming more, it is becoming more available to a domestic property as technology and the price of installation is coming down. It's capacity and sizing. The heat pump capacity, we generally measure in kilowatts. So a typical home in the UK is between 5 and 15. The average is 8. So the demand that the home requires. Depending on the size and the installation of the property, correct sizing is essential. So if we put in a heat pump that's too small, we can't meet the demand, so we can't heat the home adequately. And if we put in a unit that's too big, we actually then start to massively lose efficiency. And a larger unit gives us no real gain from a heating perspective. It just costs more money to install. So it really requires that we're designing our systems properly. We have temperature range. So again, it's important to consider. So for an air source heat pump, we can operate down to somewhere in the region below -20, -10. So we can go to super low temperatures, and that's because we're utilising a refrigerant cycle. So the refrigerant has a much lower boiling point. So the air outside we can use to just start to generate heat within that refrigerant and get it moving around our system. Yeah. So radiators, again, a big consideration. One of our main questions we get asked is, do we have to replace all of our radiators? And the answer is not necessarily. It is very dependent on the property itself. Lots of properties have already had lots of upgrades that more than meet the capacity that's required with modern heat pumps. You can get low temperature radiators that are designed to work with low temperatures and then don't need upsizing, but it is a consideration. We generally try and focus on installing underfloor heating because it gives us that larger surface area and allows us to distribute that low temperature heat around the building in a very efficient way. Some of the side questions we've got there, so are they noisy? So historically, yes, the units were noisy, but as technology has improved and demand for them has improved, they're no longer noisy in any way, shape or form. The loudest they will get is at a peak when we're really pushing them for a defrost cycle. We might hear the compressor going slightly. And again, with hot water demand, sometimes you may hear the compressor, but they're very, very quiet. Next slide, please. So we are getting ready for a heat pump now and in the future. So lots of homes currently have gas boilers in varying stages of repair, maintenance, age. One of the most important things is we don't need to be rushing out and going and having a heat pump installed straight away. I think it's important that we look at where we are, how long the life of our gas boiler, how long it's got left. And maybe every year when we're having a service, we could look and speak to our heating engineer to say, can we upgrade a room at a time? Can we upgrade the system slowly over time, making it heat pump ready? Part of that is going to be sizing it correctly. So it's going to be making sure we understand the heat loss of our home. And that is for an engineer who will come out and complete a heat loss survey. It's important to mention that that element of getting ready for a heat pump is a chargeable element. So people will quite often expect for an engineer to come out and spend a day measuring and taking the time to understand their home so they can do an accurate heat loss for free. But unfortunately, that's not a viable option for any engineer. The fabric of the building will be taken into consideration then, and we will always take a fabric first approach. So any engineer should be recommending any important upgrades to the fabric of the building prior to any sort of upgrade, unless it's due to any sort of distress purchase. So the boiler's broken and the money's better spent getting a modern system installed. So some key points to include in understanding the output and correct system sizing. I've already covered that we must know the heat loss of our home. It's really important that that's taken into account, slowly upgrading elements of our system over time, and it's always a fabric first approach. We can go to the next slide. Thank you very much. So again, using the system, we use two ways of monitoring the efficiency of the system. One would be the COP and one would be the SCOP. So we have the coefficients of performance and we have the seasonal coefficients of performance. Generally, we always look at the seasonal coefficients of performance because that's taking the annual usage of the unit. So on a yearly basis, we're taking heating and hot water demand over a 12-month period to really assess the efficiency of our system. If we just use a COP, which is the coefficient of performance, which is on a much smaller time scale, we could be looking at it in the middle of summer where we've got very minimal heating demand, minimal hot water demand, and looking at saying, haven't we got a very efficient system? So it's important to always look at it as an annual process. We also like to think when using a system, the best systems, the best design systems, the ones that you don't have to interact with. So once it's installed and set up, the less you have to interact with the system, the better the system is, the better the design has been, and your needs have been taken into consideration. Timers and controls, we generally like to use weather compensation. So again, setting up the system so it's not requiring any input from you. And then as far as timers are concerned, we avoid timers if we can. So we want the systems to run low and slow and create thermal mass within the building. So that traditional on-off mentality of I'll turn the heating on in the morning and then off, and then I'll turn it back on in the evening. We can't do that with a heat pump because it doesn't allow us to bring the temperature of the building up efficiently. Maintenance, from a maintenance perspective, they require very little maintenance, in all honesty. A main service we would try and do annually, but it would be cleaning the unit, checking it for any signs of leaks, and then servicing the hot water cylinder inside to make sure that unit itself was safe. And then aircon and other capabilities. So most heat pumps have the ability to run in reverse and operate and provide us with cooling. The main issue with that is how we distribute that energy. So if we, obviously warm air rises, so if we've got underfloor installed, if we start running cool water through that system, there's no way of us getting that cool air throughout the building. You just have very cold feet, and the rest of you will be hot, overheated. So currently, the best way is air conditioning, particularly from a commercial perspective where there's less demand for hot water. It really is probably the most viable and cost-effective option. And then I think, is there another slide for me? I don't believe there is.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks, Phil. Thank you both. Really insightful. You've obviously got such a wealth of knowledge. We're actually just going to hand back to Gareth now. He's just going to take us through a couple of things, sort of initial next steps if you are looking to get some of this tech installed in your home or business. So I'll hand off to Gareth. Thanks, Gareth.
Yeah, thanks, Rosie. So if you've been inspired by that, and let's face it, who wouldn't be? If you're thinking about what the next steps are, it's really to try and get some expert advice. And that's usually going to be from the installers themselves. You can obviously find installers through any number of routes. A lot of installers are now advertising locally, local papers, local magazines that come through our doors in Herefordshire. And of course, you've got social media, you've got things like Checker Trade. There's any number of places where you could find installers and do your research on potentially what other people have said about those installers. It's always sensible to do. It's also sensible to check that your installers have the necessary accreditations. That's the MCS, the micro certification scheme, which there is a link in the chat where you can use that to find installers. Those are the people who have been accredited to make sure that they're doing the work properly. For some of this, particularly more in a business sense, you may need to check with the council, with Herefordshire Council's planning department. Obviously, if you have a listed building, you should probably be aware. And if you are within a conservation area, then certainly solar panels and potentially heat pump. I would always recommend making sure you know exactly what position you're in with regards to any permits that might be required. Much of the planning regime is fairly supportive of this. I think it's the heritage concerns are the ones that you would have to pay most attention to. It's always good to speak to several installers. I know it's hard work, but you can find that installers will vary. Different installers will also potentially be supplied with different manufacturers' panels, different inverters, different batteries. Certain installers may use certain batteries, and so some, particularly on the solar panels and the size of the panels, some may have a better or a worse fit on your particular roof size, purely because that installer happens to use panels from a specific manufacturer who makes those panels in a specific size. It's also worth checking and phoning your installer to make sure that your quotes include everything. Typically, something like scaffolding will be required for most solar. Sometimes that's something I have seen installers put on a quote that they will only get that quote from the scaffolding company when they're ready to go and do the work. So they might not include that sort of thing on their first installation quote. It's always worth double checking and making sure you know what's included and whether there are any additional costs to be added. It's always worth checking your insurer as well. If you would need to let them know, particularly with solar panels, and it's always worth letting them know if you're changing your heating system as well. Whether this will have much an effect on your insurance premiums, I don't know, but your insurers would certainly want to know about it, and it would avoid any issues if you needed to make a claim and you hadn't informed them that you put solar panels on the roof, for example. And it's also worth being aware the difference between quotes and estimates. As I think was said right at the beginning, you can often get a good estimate even off of websites for solar panels, but they're not necessarily going to be a precise quote. And certainly for heat pumps, you need a proper qualified engineer to come and assess the heat loss of your property to make sure that your heat pump is correctly sized. That can't be done remotely. You're going to need to get somebody in to come and do that to ensure that you are getting an accurate quote, not a ballpark estimate. So those are a few final tips. And if there's anything else, I will try and keep answering the chat for the last few minutes. But I better hand off to Rosie because I think we are drawing to a close.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gareth. Really crucial bits of things to consider there. We are just going to highlight a couple of links so you can access a little bit more information about the Low Carbon Technology Training Centre and the courses that they run. When we circulate these slides, these links will be live, so you can follow those through. There's the link again for the accredited installers, and there is a live grant scheme, the Marches Energy Grant, which is available for businesses to invest in renewable energy and efficiency measures. So if you're not aware of that and want to explore that, that link is there for you as well. And then a link to the homepage for the Greener Footprints Initiative website. So the Greener Footprints Initiative, which is a Herefordshire Council initiative to support the ambitions for reaching net zero by 2030. There's all sorts of information as well as past webinars on the site, and we will always invite any suggestions for future topics as well. So we have got just a couple of minutes left in case there's any questions in the chat at all that weren't able to be answered during the time that we've had. So Tina, has there been anything in the chat that we can direct to any of our speakers?
Yes, we've got a couple of questions that Gareth hasn't answered as yet. One was for Phil Quinn on which heat pumps do you think are smarter in terms of working with variable water tank sizes based on occupancy?
Generally, most on market will be capable. It's more an issue of demand, so kilowatt output, so how much energy the unit in particular can generate. So any engineer that's sizing the property will always take hot water demand into consideration. So we'll look at heating requirements and hot water requirement to adequately size any unit to make sure it can meet that demand. If it doesn't meet the demand, then it wouldn't meet any MCS criteria. So it has to be sufficient to meet 100% of the load of the property.
Brilliant, thanks Phil, and thanks for the question, that's great. Tina, anything else?
There's a sort of Dave is sort of a bit of a statement really, so I don't know if we might have time to cover this now. Sort of suggesting that Fabric First doesn't optimize carbon savings to get to net zero, and questioning whether it's the most cost-effective way to proceed. So I don't know if you want to talk to that, Phil.
Yeah, of course. So Fabric First would always be our first option. I do agree that currently with the way the market is, Fabric First isn't necessarily a cost-effective method. What we would do if we see large inefficiencies that are going to massively affect the ability for us to install a system, those are the elements of the fabric we would want to look at. So we have sort of a minimum. It doesn't have to be excessive. So even 5 years ago, we would be looking at 400-500 mil of insulation in a loft. We can get down to a minimum of 150 to getting a system working efficiently. If you look at full house retrofit, so fabric first approach on that, that is expensive. The UK average is about £80,000, so very unrealistic. But when we say fabric first, it's more about creating draft sealing, stopping any thermal bridges. So it's making sure that our minimum standards are met really to make the system. So don't necessarily have to be very expensive.
Thanks, Phil. Thank you so much for the question as well, Dave. That is all we've got time for in this session, but if there are any more questions, feel free to reach out directly to the email address on the screen, or continue to pop them in the chat just before you go. But as we said, we'll be circulating all of the slides, all of the question content that was left in the chat, as well as the recording over the next few days. So you'll be receiving that if you've registered, as you all have. So we look forward to being able to share that. Please do get back to us with any suggestions for future topics. If you've got anything that you feel you'd like a little bit more information on, and we'll build that into our plans going forward. But for now, thank you so much, Phil Quinn. Thank you so much, Phil Kitchener and Gareth, and for you all for your time in attending today. And we'll close the webinar there. Thank you all so much.